Hello. This week we'll be doing something a little bit different where I will be discussing on the mental health impacts of religious trauma. Um, Under the caption of spilling the tea with C. Well, I'll be drinking some tea of a homemade blend that I made myself. And I'm combining a little bit of sass as well as research and lived experience and stuff like that as well. So let's dive in first with the disclosure statement. Welcome to Sacred Scars, Stories of Religious Trauma and Healing, where we explore the journey of healing from religious trauma. Today's episode may touch on sensitive topics. If you find it challenging, please practice self-care, take breaks, talk to someone you trust, or consider seeking professional help, such as therapy and or spiritual direction. So now let's dive into our talking points. So again, this is discussing the mental health impacts of religious trauma. A lot of these talking points will be focused on Dr. Marlene Weinell's religious trauma syndrome and the key dysfunctions that include the cognitive, affective, functioning, social, cultural, and then going into discussions on now what and joining the conversation of religious trauma. So moving right along, Dr. Marlene Weinell coined the term religious trauma syndrome in 2011 and was written about in the CBT Today. Citation is located in the bottom for those who are watching the video version of this. However, those who are not, you can also probably look up on your own CBT Today, religious trauma syndrome. The full title being It's Time to Recognize It. Um, and I personally don't think that it has gotten the traction it deserves, probably because it was not written by a cis white man. But that is just my opinion based on our history of mental health and research and stuff like that. Again, personal opinions, it mixed with scholarship. So moving along to cognitive, the cognitive effects include religious trauma being can resulting in confusion, difficulty with decision making, difficulty with critical thinking, dissociation, and identity confusion. So again, like trauma itself can have impacts on a person's cognition. Religious trauma can have an impact on a person's cognition as well. So with that said, religious trauma can present unique differences from other forms of trauma, especially surrounding like the difficulty with decision making. It's going to be hard for making your own decisions if you've had like some kind of religious leadership making the decisions for you for such a long time in your life. And the same would go for things like critical thinking and stuff like that. If you've lived by like a specific set of guidelines within a religious space, it's going to be hard to break out of that thinking. And it's going to be hard to kind of challenge some of that cognition. Dissociation often comes with trauma as well, where you're feeling kind of disconnected with yourself. And that can be things like feeling like your head is in the clouds, feeling like you're just kind of like watching yourself go through emotions, but you're not connected with yourself, stuff like that. And then identity confusion is like a lot of folks might experience difficulty finding who they are outside of a religious space, as well as who are they in like the world around them, who are they like religiously, spiritually, and their whole well-being. So these are some of the cognitive effects of religious trauma. And affective, oh, skipping right along, affective so religious trauma effectively can impact things like anxiety. So, generalized anxiety disorders can oftentimes come with trauma, panic attacks, depression, suicidal ideation. I also forgot to add other forms of self-harm, so non-suicidal self-injury. So things like cutting, hitting yourself, things like that, anger, grief, sense of guilt, loneliness, and lack of meaning. So religious trauma can impact all of those parts of a person's being. And even for myself, being ex-Catholic, having left the Catholic Church years ago, I personally struggled with like the air quotes like Catholic guilt for many years after leaving the church. And it's something that occasionally comes up nowadays, but it took many years of therapy for myself to recover from some of that guilt. So some may experience that. Some might even experience senses of grief if they're needing to leave a religion for whatever reason that they might need to, as it is essentially like the ending of a relationship. It's the end, like it's the end of a significant part of someone's self. And then things like anger is also understandable for folks who maybe have felt like ousted by the church or ostracized by like religious communities and stuff like that. And lack of meaning is a big one as well. It's hard to find meaning once you've learned that you've experienced trauma in a religious space where religion provides such a big sense of meaning for folks. So all of these things are understandable for a person to experience who have experienced religious trauma. And then also with trauma itself of this like impacting a person's sense of self, self-worth, stuff like that can also lead to depression, suicidal ideations, and suicidal self-injury and stuff like that. In functioning, so functioning impacts, so like religious trauma impacts things like sleeping and eating disorders or disordered sleep and disordered eating, nightmares, sexual dysfunction, substance use disorders, and somatization. And so with that, it's hard to kind of make healthy connections with the outside world if you've always had some like connection telling you how to make those connections, especially regarding things like romantic and sexual relationships or your relationship with um, your food that you eat. Substance use is a really prominent one as well for folks who've experienced trauma in general, but as well as religious trauma. And it can present different unique perspectives as different religions have different rules regarding substance. So, also struggling with a substance use disorder can also further instill some of that religious trauma, who may be coming from a religion that is strongly against substances or against the substance that that person might be using. And so religious trauma impacts a lot of those functions of a person's well-being as well. And then moving on to social cultural. So social and cultural effects of religious trauma include a division of family and social network, employment issues, financial stress, problems wow, like joining into society. Words are not working for me today. I should probably just drink some more tea. Vocal cord dysfunction for the win there. Anyway, as well as some interpersonal dysfunction. So, like difficulties with interpersonal issues, interpersonal relationships, and stuff like that. But religious trauma can create divisions within someone's familial and social relationships, as it can sometimes result in someone needing to completely leave a religion, needing to cut folks off, and it can create a significant trauma just in the closure of a community network that someone might have had. And sometimes folks don't even leave consensually. Sometimes they're kicked out of their religions for whatever reason. Um, so that can also have a significant impact on a person. And then employment issues. So trauma in general also can result in employment issues. And religious trauma, though, can create unique difficulties with employment, as well as financial stress of like some religions and denominations and stuff require like a tithe or require some kind of like financial support. And so you might already be struggling with finances. And now there's like a lot of even further strain on that relationship of needing to cut off those connections or needing to figure out some different financial steps to completely disconnect or something like that as well. And it can create a significant stressor in needing to figure out how to move on from this trauma. And then problems like uh, accommodating into society, a lot of people might have different perspectives, and a lot of folks may have had a really sheltered experience in their religious trauma, and they might not know a lot of like the social cultural norms. And so they're likely going to struggle joining into society and societal norms. And it can further instill into like impersonal, interpersonal dysfunction and stuff like that. And my computer just froze. There we go. So now what? Whoop. Now what is a lot of having these conversations, encouraging folks who might have experienced religious trauma to find a mental health provider who is skilled in talking about religious trauma. There has been a pretty big movement of more professionals exploring religious trauma, wanting to learn more about religious trauma, especially with, excuse me, with it becoming a bigger and bigger issue and being more arised with our social media and stuff like that, that these discussions are becoming more common. And I personally think it's kind of moving that these conversations are having such an impact on multiple people's lives. And I think continuing these conversations are really important in discussing religious trauma, forming a community, and finding the right support for folks who have experienced religious trauma to be able to heal effectively from their traumas, as well as process their traumas in a safe manner and not be stigmatized or not be shut down and stuff like that. So now what be educating yourself on religious trauma, the different like layers of power, privilege, and oppression that also impacts religious trauma, especially with things like religious trauma, politics, colonization, manifest like things like manifest destiny and stuff like that. Like there is like religious issues at the root of a lot of our social issues as well. So deconstructing a lot of that, um, taking part in social activisms to the best of your ability. Also be careful like with yourself, take care of yourself, stuff like that, obviously. Don't burn yourself out. Don't pour from an empty glass kind of thing. And encourage mental health support, encourage spiritual direction for those who might need it. Um, with more mental health providers learning more about religious trauma, there are more spiritual directors who are also learning more about like mental health and stuff like that. I don't think spiritual direction should be a replacement for mental health care, but I do think it could be a good relationship to have with a mental health provider and a spiritual director, both in terms of if you're wanting to pursue like more spiritual supports as well as mental health supports. Like myself personally, that's how I recovered from a lot of my own religious traumas while I was in seminary, in grad school and stuff like that. I saw someone for my spiritual supports and stuff like that, and I saw a mental health provider and was able to do both effectively to help me explore my own religious traumas, deconstruct a lot of those traumas, and recover from it. And now, as like many years later, I'm using that to provide support for those who need it, as well as learning how to be like the best mental health provider myself, specializing in complex and religious trauma and including a lot of my social activisms. So the now what, doing what you feel called to do while taking care of yourself, as well as opening more of the discussions of religious trauma. And a way to join the conversation is following our podcast, Sacred Scars, Stories of Religious Trauma and Healing. My Instagram page is sacred_scars_pod. And then I also have a LinkedIn that provides the information on where all the podcast is available at, as well as like YouTube link, Instagram link, and a link for a Google form as I am actively looking for more guests. Although I love having these discussions and drinking some tea and discussing like the issues in our world regarding religious trauma, mental health, I also want to involve more stories as that is a main preface of this platform is stories of religious trauma from folks who have experienced religious trauma. So that link is in my link tree. So the word link tr.ee/sacred scars. And it'll have a Google form saying like open call or calling for podcast guests and fill out that form. There are community guidelines listed on there as I need to be sure that I'm following my own personal ethics and stuff, as well as making sure that this place is maintaining a healthy platform and not becoming something that is harmful. So there are community guidelines listed on that Google form as well for those who might want to be a guest on Sacred Scars. And so that was my spiel on the mental health impacts of religious trauma. There are plenty more. I have had a conversation with two lovely mental health providers a couple weeks ago about mental health impacts on religious trauma. Uh, Apologies, I had a long day working already, and I'm just recording this late in the night. But I had a lovely conversation with a couple other mental health providers. So there's also a larger discussion on that episode as well. And you can see that episode on all of my platforms that this podcast is available at. And